Welcome to the Phantom Canyon Road driving tour. You should be traveling north on Road 67. I'll be telling you a lot of stories as you drive up Phantom Canyon today. It's part of the Gold Belt Scenic and Historic Byway, all belonging to the Colorado and National Byways system. The Gold Belt Byway is also known as the Road to Riches that served our legendary Cripple Creek mining district. Phantom Canyon Road follows the route of an historic railroad. It was called the Florence and Cripple Creek, or the F&CC for short. A group of businessmen built it so they could get rich, hauling the ore dug out of America's greatest gold camp. For nearly 2 decades, that little train carried the gold dug from mines near Cripple Creek and Victor, down to Florence and Canon City. Oh yeah, those were the glory days. The F&CC was the busiest narrow-gauge railroad in the West. Heck, it had to be. The Cripple Creek mining district produced nearly $500 million worth of gold back then, more than the Alaska and California gold rushes combined. Today, that gold would be worth billions. The speed limit is 50 miles per hour here. That will change to 20 miles per hour pretty soon, so watch for the signs. This tour is timed to match the posted speed limits. Please, take your time today. If traffic or weather slows you down, just stop the tour until you can catch up. The trip up Phantom Canyon to Cripple Creek takes about 2 hours one way. Remember, there are no services in the canyon, not until Victor, which is near the end of our tour, and no gas stations until you make it to the Cripple Creek area. Now, relax and enjoy the scenery while I tell you the stories. We'll be passing through many different environments as we climb almost 5,000 feet. We start here at the edge of the plains and end up surrounded by mountain forests and meadows. I'll be pointing out changes in the plants and wildlife as we travel along. Right now, we're surrounded by pasture land where livestock graze. Keep an eye out for prairie dogs. Look for the mounds of dirt they pile up above their burrow. Listen for their high-pitched whistle. The few trees scattered about are juniper. You'll also see cactus along the road. That's cholla. But hey, here I am rambling on about this pretty countryside. We need to get some history under our belts. Now our story begins back in 1889, when Colorado's last big gold boom was just getting underway. The fever hit a local cowboy first. His name was Bob Womack. Old Bob found some small samples of gold in an area called Poverty Gulch. That's up near Cripple Creek. Well, people just laughed at him. Bob was known as a coffee cooler. You know, a talker and a dreamer. I hear he tilted the bottle pretty often, too. But he kept right on searching. Finally, Womack came across a piece of flat rock that tested good. Oh boy, did the word spread fast. Well, that was the end of quiet cattle country southwest of Pikes Peak. Prospectors flocked to the area and settlements sprouted up all around the mines. Just imagine those eager prospectors with big dollar signs in their eyes. Little did they know there was a problem up in the district. Sure, there was lots of gold to be found, but it was all tied up in rock. Reduction mills were necessary to get the gold out of the rock. I've asked a friend of mine to explain the situation. He was a longtime resident and one of our most knowledgeable railroad historians. We were lucky to get some interviews with him a while back. Reverend Morris Kafke.
Mills could not be located at the mines to any great extent because of their need for water and for coal hauled upgrade. It was more sensible to build the mills near sources of water at Florence, for example, and haul the ore downgrade by railway.
Only one problem with that. Wagons were the only way to haul it. And hauling ore any distance by wagon was too expensive, time-consuming. A fella just couldn't turn a profit. So rocks started piling up at the mines. Another means of transportation was desperately needed. That's where some local businessmen came into the picture. They figured that if they could find an economical way to haul that rock, they would become rich men. Those businessmen were from Florence, little town with big dreams of cashing in on the gold boom. Florence was laid out south of here along the Arkansas River. It had lots of water and plenty of fuel in the form of coal and oil. In other words, everything needed for ore reduction. James A. McCandless saw the potential in the situation. He was the founder of Florence. Around 1892, McCandless got together with a fellow named David H. Moffett, another prominent businessman of the day. Moffett was a real tycoon with investments all over the state. McCandless had the vision, Moffett had the pocketbook. Together, they came up with a way to solve the transportation problem. They joined forces to build a narrow-gauge railroad. They named it the Florence and Cripple Creek. You should be hitting the gravel road here real soon. We're about to enter the canyon. Right in this area was where the Kramer Railroad Station used to stand. During the railroad days, Kramer had a telegraph office, a water tank, and a pump house, a bunkhouse for the railroad workers, plus some other buildings. Like most of the station sites we'll be passing, most everything's gone today.
Some of them burned down and others were just torn down for the lumber. There were still a couple of the station buildings in the canyon and houses at Wilbur when I was a very small boy, but they disappeared by the time I was in high school.
This area is at 5,600 feet or so. By the time we reach Cripple Creek, we'll be at nearly 10,000 feet, so hold on to your hats. Phantom Canyon is all uphill, and the road is narrow. Remember, keep your foot off that gas pedal. 20 miles per hour is the posted speed limit in most of the canyon. Be courteous to other drivers. Stay to the right, especially on curves. You may need to pull over so oncoming traffic can pass. The road's still fairly flat here, but it's going to get steeper in just a few miles. Then the grade won't let up until Victor. The early narrow-gauge steam railroads weren't powerful enough to handle the steep grades in the canyon. When loaded with heavy supplies, the train needed 2 or 3 helper engines to pull the cars up. The helper engines were hooked up at the mouth of the canyon at the Kramer station. They'd haul the train up to a station just before Victor, where the terrain levels out. Then they'd unhook and head back down the canyon to haul another load. This lower part of the canyon is famous for an event that took place with one of those helper engines back in July of 1895, just a year after the rail bed was completed. Keep in mind that the first rails were laid right next to that creek bed over there on your right.
They were returning light from one of these helper turns when they ran into a heavy cloudburst, and they could tell it was storming farther up the canyon. They looked behind them at one point and saw this wall of water coming, so they opened the throttle and went down the canyon as fast as they could. Which was rather a risky business. It'd be risky driving the car down on the present road, you know. But they managed to get out of the canyon just in time.
The helper crew escaped, but 6 other people weren't so lucky. They died in that flood. It also destroyed 12 miles of track. That wasn't a big surprise to the railroad owners. They already had plans to raise the rail bed. Now they had to get busy. Doris Wolfe, another one of our regional historians, sums it up quite nicely.
One of Moffat's henchmen, or whatever you want to call him, had written a letter to Moffat saying, "We have to do something about our submarine railroad."
Work began right away. In just 8 months, the rails were raised. And that seemed to do the trick. The F&CC didn't suffer any more major flood damage for another 16 years. Building a railroad right in a creek bed? Who could be so foolish? They knew it was prone to flooding, didn't they? Well, that's another story. When Moffat's crew began construction of F&CC from the south, another company started building a rival railroad from the north at the same time. That one was called the Midland Terminal. The F&CC owners were determined to have their railroad reach Cripple Creek first. It was a race to the finish, so they took some shortcuts. like laying rail in the creek bed. They cut some other corners too.
So the project would be as inexpensive as possible. That was the idea. They adopted a narrow gauge of 3 feet between the rails. They didn't have to do as much grading for serving what they thought might be a very temporary mining district.
The track layers worked fast. Within just 6 months, they completed the F&CC narrow gauge line to Cripple Creek. A passenger train full of excited travelers pulled out of Florence, chugged up Phantom Canyon, and arrived in Cripple Creek on July 4th, 1894. The F&CC owners were proud, but they weren't ready to heave a sigh of relief yet. Running a railroad through such treacherous country was quite a financial risk. No one knew if the railroad could make a profit. Not to worry, the risk paid off. The F&CC covered its construction costs in its first year of operation, a cool $1 million. In no time, Florence's 8 reduction mills were operating around the clock, and life improved at the other end of the line too. The miners enjoyed a lot of supplies they never would have had without the railroads.
They hauled general merchandise, mining machinery and supplies, explosives for use in the mines, lumber, bricks, and building materials because the towns were growing like mad in the district. Merchandise, of course, included groceries, also liquor, including hard stuff and beer because the miners drank quite a bit. They weren't luscious, but when you came out of a mine, you needed to get some of that dust out of your throat.
Pretty soon you should be coming to the first railroad tunnel. It was built when they raised the rails after that flood I told you about. At that time, 1,500 men were on the F&CC payroll. Sent a bunch of them up here. Building a 160-foot tunnel through solid granite was no picnic, even for hardy railroad men.
Well, it was largely hand labor. They had one man holding a drill, another man hit at it with his sledgehammer. They may have used power drills too, that's possible. Then they would put dynamite in the holes and blow out more rock and start over again.
Let him down, dude. Let him down.
Let's take a short break from history now and look around at the countryside. Look over at the stream on the right. That's 8 Mile Creek. Most of the trees are cottonwoods, and obviously they like water. They grow in what biologists call riparian areas. That's their big word for stream sides. Now look up at the rocky slopes. The trees on top are gambrel oak, pinyon, and juniper. They thrive on drier sites. As for wildlife, you'll probably see mostly squirrels and birds, maybe a few cottontails, unless you're driving at dawn or dusk. Then you'll see more. Wildlife loves the canyon because it's so remote. Peregrine falcons and other raptors, bobcats, and mountain lions feel very at home in the canyon. They all like the rough, rocky areas where few people can get to. Life in the canyon back in the time of the railroad was very different from what we see and know today. Morris Kafke.
We don't realize how hard it was in those days. Have to get up in the morning and it's freezing out. You have to start a fire in the stove, cook your meal, and the houses were not too pretentious. They must have leaked cold air like a sieve.
They shared food and that kind of thing, but they were very far apart. They had goats for milk and raised a few sheep and, of course, lived on the wild animals and berries and the fruit in the area. They could grow a few crops. Any place where there was a flat piece of land or where they could clear the rocks out of, they would plant any kind of crop that would grow. Their community would be around the railroad station.
Oh yes, everyone loved the railroad. It meant coal from Florence for cooking and heating, plus a bounty of other supplies. And the train carried the mail, always welcome in the days before telephones. Once in a while, Phantom Canyon residents would pack up and take a rail trip to see friends and relatives. That was a big deal. For months, kids would count the days, looking forward to when they would get to ride in one of the fancy passenger cars on the F&CC's Gold Belt line.
Some of them were quite luxurious. You know, they had gas lights on them, they're so-called electric lights, and heat, and they had some Pullman cars.
You were sitting in a red plush seat in a day coach, the engine working up ahead, and no air conditioning. You had the windows open if it were summer. Once in a while you get a cinder in your eye, especially if you went through a tunnel. But I think it was a lot more fun than riding a jet aircraft.
Now we're getting near another station known as McCourt. It had a telegraph office. The telegraph was established in the canyon just a little over a year after the railroad was completed. Good thing, there had to be some way to keep track of the 7 or 8 freights that rumble by each day at the height of the gold frenzy, along with 3 passenger trains. Traffic got pretty heavy at times.
There had to be telegraph offices at 3 different points simply to pass up train orders in order to keep the various passenger and freight trains off of each other's coattails.
We're starting to get a little higher now. We're almost at 6,500 feet, about 1,000 feet higher than when we entered the canyon. Can you see how the landscape is changing as we increase elevation? Take a look at the hillsides around you. See if you can pick out the Douglas fir trees. They look like huge Christmas trees. Their branches are wide at the bottom and taper to a point at the top. Douglas firs prefer cooler locations, so you'll see them mostly on north-facing slopes. The southern slopes get more sun, so they're warmer and drier. Different trees grow there, including pinyon and juniper. I'm always real careful when I walk around these dry, rocky slopes. Some dangerous critters live around here. Rattlesnakes are fairly common in the canyon, especially in the rocky, dry areas, so watch out. Phantom Canyon is still a very wild place because it's remained so isolated over the years. That's a big part of its charm, of course. Have Have you seen any dirt roads off to the side of this one yet? Maybe down near the creek? In a few places, the remains of old wagon roads can still be seen. Some folks say they're from Phantom Canyon's first road that was built just 1 year before the railroad.
When the Cripple Creek mining discovery was made in 1891, many towns wanted to get in on the gravy as transportation centers. So the city of Florence built a crude wagon road up the canyon of 8 Mile Creek to serve the Cripple Creek mines with wagon traffic.
I heard tell that road was built in just 45 days. It was called the Free Road because it was built after the Shelf Road, which is west of here. The Shelf Road was a toll road. Either way, whether you traveled for free or paid a toll, the wagon ride from Florence to the mining district took a slow and dusty 6 hours. Pretty soon here, you should be coming to the second railroad tunnel. Be careful driving through when you get there. It's just 1 lane wide. And be sure to take a close look at its solid granite walls. It's hard to imagine building a tunnel through a mountain using nothing but a drill and explosives. But that's what they did, just like the first tunnel we drove through earlier today. We're lucky to have tunnels like these. As you've probably noticed, not much remains from the F&CC days, so what we do have is precious. Years ago, folks would come up and look for the old rails and pull them out. Most of them had been hauled out during World War I, when iron was scarce. Today, all of the rails are gone. But don't worry, I've got plenty of other things to show you up ahead. Now we're coming up on an area that's remembered as the site of a Works Project Administration, or WPA camp. During the Great Depression, WPA crews were sent to the canyon to build bridges and maintain the roadbed. That was years after the railroad closed down, of course. The WPA crew built their camp in this area. Watch over on the right side of the road. You'll see an old concrete foundation. It's up a dirt path and surrounded by tall grass, so drive slowly while you take a look. That foundation is all that's left of the WPA camp. We're getting up a little higher now. This is a good place to look up and scan the cliffs for some of our larger feathered friends. The cliffs offer some good protection for nests. You might see golden eagles or red-tailed hawks, what we call soaring raptors. Up ahead is the location of a small community named Adelaide. Today this is private property, but during the railroad days, Adelaide had a post office and a railroad station that served as a hotel of sorts. Trains would stop at Adelaide so their crews and passengers could take a break. Some stayed the night. It's also where the trains took on water. I want to show you some traces of Adelaide along here, so keep an eye out. They're right after the sign that says Adelaide. Do you see the sign yet? As soon as you pass the sign, find a place to stop for a moment and look down on the right side of the road. You'll see a round stone foundation. That's all that's left of the Adelaide water tank. The early trains had to carry lots of water for their steam engines and to put out frequent fires started by flying cinders. This area is remembered for one of the railroad's tragedies. It happened during the 1895 flood I told you about earlier. Its raging waters wiped out the boarding house at the Adelaide station, drowning the cook, the proprietor, and 4 other people. Have you been wondering how Phantom Canyon got its name? That's what everyone who visits wants to know. To tell you the truth, I don't have the answer. No one else does either. Plenty of people like to speculate, though. One tale is about a spirit.
She is supposed to be the phantom lady who protects the canyon and causes all the disasters to keep human beings out of it.
Sounds to me like some of the railroad's misfortunes may have inspired that legend.
Well, it's ironic that in July you've got to watch out for a flood in Phantom Canyon, and I've talked to some people who believe you better stay out of the canyon in July.
Now remember, especially if you're traveling in July, that's just a legend. Morris has a more practical explanation.
The term Phantom Canyon was probably developed by the railroad's advertising department. It was simply the canyon of 8 Mile Creek, and some demon copywriter, looking at the interesting rock formations there, thought, oh, this is like a canyon full of phantoms, and they christened it in their tourist brochures, and the name stuck.
I've traveled the canyon at night. Now, that's something you want to avoid. As you can imagine, this road's dangerous in the dark, and it can get pretty spooky too, especially when there's a full moon and the rock formations start playing tricks on your eyes. But during the daytime, the road's perfectly safe and a real treat scenery-wise, don't you agree? If it's the right time of year, you may see cattle grazing. Ranchers have grazed their cattle in the canyon for over 100 years. Even though there have always been mountain lions and coyotes around here that could take some of their livestock. They just decided to take their chances, I guess. Probably because of the mild winters. Ranchers can graze livestock year-round here without giving them much feed. There's always a chance you'll see mule deer, and as you head farther up the canyon, some Rocky Mountain elk. During the warmer months, in the early evenings or mornings, you might even spot a black bear. Now we are at the only F&CC bridge that survived. Drive over it very slowly, but don't worry, it may look rickety, but it's not.
When the railroad was dismantled, they decided that the state could jolly well put a detour in around the steel bridge. They were going to try to salvage the steel. So they took 4 locomotives coupled together to the bridge and tried to pull the bridge over, and all the engines did was spin their driving wheels helplessly. They couldn't get the bridge down, and they didn't want to spend the money cutting it down with torches, so they just left it in place.
When my husband and I were doing some photography there at the steel bridge, we had come up out of the creek bed, and there were some men from the state highway department. They had been under the structure, and so we waited. When they got back up the top, I said, well, how sturdy is it? And he said, sturdy as a rock. There's nothing wrong with this bridge.
Now we're getting to an area known as the Narrows. It's where they had to blast away parts of the canyon wall in order to build the rail bed. You'll see, the cliffs get steeper and the road gets windier. If you're one of the lucky passengers, you'll really enjoy this part of the tour. It's what the biologists call a transition zone, where lower elevation plants grow with those from higher elevations. You'll see spruce and fir forests, ponderosa and pinyon pines in drier, sunnier areas, and aspens too, all growing in the midst of these amazing rock formations. Lots of beautiful country. If you're the driver, please remember to take it easy and be ready to pull over. The road continues to narrow to 1 lane in many places. Be especially cautious in the passages where you can't see if another car is coming. Dunville was the location of one of the mining district's last labor disputes. It began when the mine owners tried to squeeze more work out of the miners without paying them any more wages. Doris Wolf.
And they were making $3 a day, and they wanted to extend the hours to 10 to 12 hours. So consequently, this was enough for some labor union people to get in and organize the miners.
Dunville became the headquarters for some of the striking union men who were accused of some major havoc, like setting off mine explosions, planting bombs at various locations, and causing train derailments.
Many of them had been driven out of Victor during the strike because they were union people, and they were afraid for their lives. They were threatened.
Soon after the strikers gathered in Dunville, a rumor spread around the district that they were planning to storm the Victor Armory. 150 of their fellow strikers had been placed under guard there. Hearing the rumor, the lieutenant governor declared the county to be in a state of insurrection and rebellion. Then he sent in the militia. On June 8, 1904, they arrived at Dunville on an F&CC boxcar and started firing their machine guns. This was too much for the Dunville group. They quickly gave up their stronghold. Amazingly, there was only one casualty. Men with guns were seen on the F&CC on other occasions as well.
A favorite sport in the Cripple Creek district was high grading. That's miners' jargon for stealing rich ore. Some of the ore was so rich you could steal a hatful of it and be like stealing a hatful of $10 gold pieces. To avoid such looting, they put much of the more valuable ore in sealed boxcars. Sometimes they had armed guards on the train, so the people wouldn't help themselves when the train stopped somewhere in the canyon for one reason or another.
The area is also remembered for a false gold strike. Prospectors rushed here for claims that proved worthless. Many of the locals just rolled their eyes, saying, anyone who knew anything about geology would know better than to look for gold in Phantom Canyon. It was miles from the volcanic region where real gold was being found. But according to Morris, the miners who struck it rich up in Cripple Creek weren't much smarter, just luckier.
Most of the discoveries were made by people who didn't know a thing about geology. The geologic formations in Cripple Creek were all wrong. There had never been anything seen like them. So these amateurs dug any place and often struck it rich.
Almost all the district's gold was found in one steep geological formation called a caldera, which is about the same thing as a crater. It was created by a series of volcanic eruptions about 6 million years ago. The caldera is shaped like a bowl and covers about 6 square miles. From what I understand, this is how the gold got there. First, eruptions created cracks and crevices in the earth. Then, liquefied gold seeped into the cracks. It cooled and hardened into gold ore right up near the surface, where the lucky prospectors could find it. As we climb up in elevation here, we're seeing more aspen trees. They're those tall, slender trees with white bark. The leaves are small and almost round. During the summer, their leaves are a light green color. Some folks around here call aspens quakies. The name comes from the way their leaves quiver in the wind. If you're driving through the canyon in autumn, I'll bet you're enjoying their yellow and orange colors. In my opinion, you can't beat our Colorado mountains for fall scenery. Just up ahead is the site of another community known as Wilbur. It was Phantom Canyon's largest settlement, home to 15 families. Max Bond's family was one of them.
I was born in 1903. We moved down here in 1910. And of course, in the winter time, you couldn't get to town, and so we would play cards at night by kerosene, no electric light. I started to go in school here, I believe, in 1911, and went through the 8th grade here, and got education I got right here, except for the ones that through the hard knocks and everything.
You should be near the sign for Wilbur now. Start watching the left side of the road for some of Wilbur's stone foundations. They're a little ways beyond the sign. Please remember, this is private property. Wilbur had the only school in the canyon. Imagine, it's a cold winter day. The sun hasn't cleared the ridge yet, and you're walking along the railroad tracks on your way to school. Max Bond remembers,
we had a one-room school and one teacher with a pot-bellied stove in the middle for heat, and that was the way we heated it.
The train would throw coal off very often, and the kids would come down from the school and get the paddy wagon out of the old shed there and load the coal up. That was part of their school job.
Like most communities in the canyon, the railroad was Wilbur's lifeline. Ranchers depended on it for shipping their livestock to the district. The town's little lumber mill relied on the railroad to haul its lumber up to Cripple Creek and Victor. And local residents anxiously awaited the many goods the railroad brought each week. So when the F&CC ended, it was sad for all of Phantom Canyon's communities. This is a good place to tell you about the final undoing of our little narrow gauge railroad. It was another flash flood. In July, no less. It was 1912, just 18 years after the first train had chugged up the canyon. Another huge storm started. Within minutes, a wall of water 30 feet high began roaring down the canyon, tearing up 5 miles of track and ripping 12 bridges from their abutments. When it was all over, the owners inspected the wreckage. They said there was too much damage and they couldn't afford to rebuild the track. But really, a lot more than the flood was involved. 2 other railroads were outcompeting the F&CC for the district's business, and gold production was declining. Morris has the details.
Gradually, the traffic diminished on the Florence and Cripple Creek, and the mills in Florence were closed, and the railroad was living on borrowed time, and they only had about 1 train a day, and they finally determined they didn't need the narrow gauge anymore. They simply abandoned it.
Fortunately for us, the locals were not willing to lose access to Phantom Canyon. Within a short time, a bunch of volunteers got busy building a road along the old railroad route. The new road opened in 1918. Despite the floods and rock slides that have closed the road off and on over the years, it has remained a popular scenic drive ever since. Up ahead, a little further, is what we locals call the Wilbur Loop. The road gets even steeper and windier, so drive carefully. In one place you will notice it does a complete switchback. Can you imagine building a railroad track on this terrain? It was quite an engineering feat for the day. After you travel for a while, the road will open up to some spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. These are just some of the mountain ranges that make Colorado famous. Just beautiful. Then you'll start catching glimpses of the town of Victor. Straight ahead is Battle Mountain, one of the richest areas in the district. Miners pulled $125 million worth of gold out of that one mountain. You probably noticed Victor as you drove in. It's to your left. Look in the opposite direction now, to your right. On a clear day, you can see Pikes Peak in the distance. It's over 14,000 feet tall. We natives have a name for those peaks. We call them 14ers. Colorado's got more than 50 of them. Now let's get going into town. Be careful pulling out of the parking lot. Follow the paved road towards Victor. In 1900, Victor had almost 8,000 residents. Along with Cripple Creek, it housed most of the district's population. But the two cities were very different.
Cripple Creek had most of the mine managers and professional men, whereas Victor was more exclusively a working man's town.
Victor was also called the City of Mines. No wonder. Look around you.